to rearrange on the other. That is just absolutely not possible. So, can we start the session? I believe it is. So I would like to wish you a very warm welcome to this important session today on the third day of the third UNESCO World Higher Education Conference organized here by UNESCO in Barcelona, and on a very important part of the education sector, higher education. We're very pleased to co-host this joint session with UNESCO, the Education 2030 section, and the ESD part of the work of UNESCO, the SDSN and Mission 4.7, and IAU, and to welcome speakers from many parts of the world, from the UK, from Ireland, from Thailand, from UNESCO in Paris, from the Global Student Forum in Austria and Kenya, and to welcome the UNESCO Chairs Network before welcoming the Association of Commonwealth Universities, ACU, to be with us here today. We here discuss where higher education and research for sustainable development can and must go, and how to develop renewed synergies for a sustainable way forward. 2022 is a critical year, as we have heard throughout the conference. A year in which we see a growing number of challenges, unfortunately confirming many of the challenges we already identified and knew, but we see many new challenges developing at local, at regional, and at global level. So it's a critical year. Past years have been critical, and the next ones will be again for all education levels, and certainly for the higher education sector itself. We have confirmed this throughout the sessions of the World Higher Education Conference. Universities and other higher education institutions are really one of the major keys to greener, fairer, and more inclusive societies. So our question for this session really is, are universities ready, or are they made ready to assume their responsibilities? A big question that we've tried to address also in other sessions, and we hope to give some new responses to here today. The 2030 Agenda, Transforming Our World, says it all, and the 17 SDGs are a backdrop of the conference, a cross-cutting theme. You even see it in the colors of the conference logo. But it should be much more than words, and it should be much more than a logo itself or the little logos that we know. And universities have made sure that it translated into great actions around the world, but we can do more. So it's a good framework for action at all levels of education. But it is a framework that we have to explore much better, even now that we know that 2030 is around the corner. Another report is key and was part of the conversations all through, and will be part of the conversations for the decades to come. And that's the Future of Education report that was launched this year, was launched at the conference just the other day and discussed throughout sessions. And it is calling for renewed perspectives on futures and together. It's calling also for what they call the new social contract of universities, and we would say for a renewed attention for social engagement of universities. And it goes way beyond 2030, and it already looks at 2050, but we should not keep on postponing deadlines. We have the deadline of today, and we can do a lot in order for the education sector and the higher education sector in particular to be more inclusive and to really align with this principle of interdisciplinarity, transdisciplinarity, and more transformative education, as you will hear from the keynote and also from the speakers here. So we will debate in particular how this concept that we've been announcing in so many fora and also debating in our institution, the concept of a whole institution approach can be applied. What does it mean and how it translates in the sector? We also need a whole sector approach, and that has been said repeatedly, but beyond a whole sector approach, we need a whole society approach to everything that we do, society at large, in order to better sustain and support a society that can ensure a better future for the many, and actually develop the kind of education we need for a society in which we all wish our future generation, but this generation as well, to live in. So we have to ensure that we reach the goals set, maybe not by the deadline. We know that deadlines are also there to push us and to push us to action, but we need to use this framework to really get our act together even better. So we need to accelerate the fundamental transformation processes that are needed, because all the actors in education can be involved, are involved, and should be supported properly for better involvement of the leadership, of the students, of citizens at large. The guiding questions for this session, you will see them on the slides later on as well, is what are the structural changes and innovations that are already being made to develop this better future together? Is a whole of institution approach and a whole sector approach possible? And what challenges and barriers do we need to remove in order to get there? How can governments and organizations like those represented at the conference and in the room make the difference to support this transformation even better? So our keynote speaker today is Stephen Sterling, Emeritus Professor of Sustainable Education at the Center of Sustainable Future at the University of Plymouth. In the name of sustainable development, he's decided, also in the context of the new digital transformation of our world, to speak to us from home, but he will be online. And then the section will be such that he will present some major ideas on this transformation and the possibility of the sector to really offer new ways to look at the world in which we live. And then we have a very esteemed panel here with us who will react to the presentation first, so in the sequencing and the way in which we are seated here in the room today. We have some speakers online as well, and we will then address the questions that we have. So we hope for a very dynamic session and an opportunity for us all to bring these ideas to the table, and we hope to generate enough time as well for the audience to react to the different topics that will have been raised. But before doing so, I'm pleased to give the floor to Pam Fredman, the president of the International Association of University, and next to Paul Walsh, who's the director and vice president of SDSN, for opening the session even more officially.
Thank you. So I'm happy to be here and welcome you all to this session, and it's on a very, very crucial topic. And it's organized by UNESCO and IAU and the SDSN. And I would say first that IAU has actually 70 years of experience of corporations within the higher educations as a global network for higher education institutions and organizations, and also as the global voice. IAU was inaugurated by UNESCO 1950, and I have to repeat that it was in the need expressed from the higher education institutions leaders that we need a community, an international community for higher educations to promote and advocate for the role of higher education. And that was 70 years back, and we still have a very, very strong need of that cooperation. So coming to the sustainable development, IAU has been engaged in higher education for sustainable development since the beginning of the 19th. And have also produced several statements, and I would like to mention the Kyoto Statement, 1993, and the Quito Statement, which was also part of coming into the SDGs and the agenda, and that had a focus on the indigenous questions and perspectives. So, when we had the 2030 agenda, IAU also reacted and had started a cluster of universities around the world to share and to help each other to develop and also share to others the sustainable development practices, experience, and what to do. And we will hear more about that. So IAU has been involved in policy statement discussions for many, many years. And I would like to mention also the cooperation between the AUF and the ACU in the high-level political forum. And I appreciate that cooperation. And I think that it raised a stronger voice. So sharing and exchange and also find solutions to the local needs and the global perspectives of those is very, very important. And I have to say that this is in my heart. It's in the heart of what I have been doing. As a rector for many, many years, I've been working at my university and introduced the sustainable development parts. It's also one of my main interests of when being the president for the IAU, although I'm involved in all parts. But it is an urgent thing, and I think that sustainable development is an umbrella of all what we are doing. So there is a lot of knowing and competence already to be implemented into the society. We don't have to wait for new research. And I think that the vaccine during the COVID was one example. That was many, many decades of work with the knowledge already being there. And we had a vaccine in a short time we'd never seen before. So I will finish and say that cooperation within the higher education sector and also with societal stakeholders, that's the way to realize the Agenda 2030. And I hope that the universities are ready to do so. So welcome.
Thank you. Maybe you want to come? No, you can sit with us, and you may wish to also comment. I may borrow your pen for that matter.
Okay.
Wonderful. So very pleased to now give the floor to Patrick Paul Walsh, who's the Director and Vice President of SDSN. And you have a recording, Paul, that we will show in a second. And I will invite the colleagues from the technical sector to pull up the first video.
Good local time to everyone. I am Patrick Paul Walsh, Vice President of Education and Director of the SDG Academy at SDSN. It is a joy to be part of the UNESCO World Higher Education Conference in Barcelona. The joint session on higher education's role in securing the future brings together a wonderful partnership, including UNESCO, IAU, SDSN and Mission 4.7. I am also delighted to see the joint session has the voice of the younger generation represented by the Global Student Forum. In 2020, SDSN's SDG Academy launched the global initiative Mission 4.7 in partnership with UNESCO, the Ban Ki-moon Center for Global Citizens, the Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia University, IAU and many other partners to accelerate the implementation of transformative education for sustainable development around the world. Mission 4.7 highlights the crucial importance of the continuum of sustainable development education in lifelong learning to achieve the SDGs. I'm really looking forward to our keynote speaker today, Professor Stephen Sterling. His inspirational career and scholarship is shaping the way we are reimagining our futures together and the endless possibilities that education can play as a means of implementing the UN 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Universities by design are based on an intergenerational dialogue to create knowledge for the future. Unfortunately, this knowledge is not always created as fair, open science for a global commons, nor in the main is it orientated towards the SDGs, nor is it easily shared to empower the future of the least developed countries, or easily disseminated into policy, corporate, society to create a safe place for humanity to survive and strive. Higher education institutions need to take leadership roles in a whole of sector and society mission to drive education and lifelong learning towards the SDGs. Stephen Sterling convinces us that such holistic approaches to teaching and learning, research and community engagement is required to trigger true transformation at local, national, regional and global levels. Heroic leadership in education for sustainable development by individual students, professors, presidents of universities, the members of UNESCO, AIU, SDSN and Mission 4.7 do create waves of inspiration. But it's the direction of the tides in the sea itself that need to change. So I am looking forward to the contributions of everyone in this joint session to help higher education be the driver of the system change that secures equity, peace and sustainable development for us all.
So thank you very much, Paul. You're also with us online. and you will be able to take questions towards the end of the session or during the session as well. So the session is now officially opened with all our partners, and there are many more, of course, working on sustainable development, but we will highlight what is possible in higher education. I give the floor now to you, Stephen Sterling. You're the Emeritus Professor of Sustainable Education at the Center of Sustainable Futures at the University of Plymouth. You've been involved with much of the work on the transformation of higher education and also in many of the projects that UNESCO has led over time. So you're the speaker that we are waiting to hear more from and to discuss the different points that you will be able to make. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Hillage, and thank you, Paul, for your introduction. Greetings, everybody, from Devon. It's rather wet here at the moment. I hope the weather's better in Barcelona. Greetings. Thank you to IAU and to UNESCO for inviting me to give this keynote. Here is a bold and open question. Is your educational policy and practice commensurate with the scale of the global crises which are now determining our collective future? By commensurate, I mean fully alive to and responsive to the huge challenges that face us in the coming few years and decades, and also committed to securing the future, to quote the title of this session. I'm going to talk about the need to reimagine and rethink education radically if we are to address the systemic issues that threaten the future. And you may find this a little provocative, and maybe that's a good thing. But I think necessarily so. I recognize at the outset there's a good deal of excellent work going on in higher education with regard to these issues. There really is, particularly in research. But my argument is that overall, higher education is not aligned to the realities of complexity, instability, unsustainability, and the need for a rapid socio-economic transition towards a livable and safer planet and world. Also that we are in a position of unprecedented urgency. I've been working in this area for nigh on 50 years, so I guess that gives me some kind of basis to give this overview. It's a huge topic, and my role here is to offer some key points to stimulate discussion rather than attempt to cover the ground. First, a little historical context. Next month, as I think you all know, there will be held the Stockholm Plus 50 conference celebrating the first UN conference on the human environment, held in 1972. Well, in that same year, I walked into a bookshop in London and came out with a book on the left there, Teaching for Survival, an intriguing title then, and I picked it up and it exactly changed my life, but it certainly influenced the course of my career. So that title, Teaching for Survival, if it was relevant then in 1972, 50 years ago, it's a lot more relevant today. Stockholm, as you may know, was the time also of the idea of only one Earth, of the limits to growth study, and so on. There's a huge flourishing of concern at that time. It also included the first international recognition that education had a critical role to address what were then seen only as environmental issues. So that was then, 50 years ago. Now, this is now, the stakes are very much higher. As we know, as many scientists and commentators are saying, the next few years are critical to determining the kind of future we and the planet as a whole collectively faces. So what happened in the 50 years or so in between 1972 and today? Well, in a way, we kind of went to sleep. A systemic crisis that has been building for decades is now evident in rapidly growing inequality, migration, unstable climate, drastic loss of biodiversity, and social and psychological trauma. As reflected in the UN Secretary General's statement on Earth Day last month, at the top of this slide, that was just last month in April, and in March, he said progress on the SDGs is going backwards. Now, the kind of issues, this whole raft of issues referred to often as wicked problems, to use that term, they are systemically interrelated and they present an unprecedented and very urgent existential threat. Now, I don't want to be too critical, but it seems that those three key characteristics are not really absent and not really present in the UNESCO concept note for this conference. A number of economists and scientists are now talking about the inevitability of a post-growth world and the real possibility of some kind of collapse in the not too distant future. At present, education is entirely aligned to the assumption of a growth economy. However, this crisis is now precipitating deep questions about long-held patterns of human activity, right across the board in economics, development, food, energy, health, design, and so on, but also about the role of education. So although environmental and sustainability education has been on the agenda for years, there's now a new intensity, and I think we can all recognize that of interest and practice. So the question really is, in the title of this talk, this is the kind of title that people are asking, are we educating for a future that nobody wants, or a future that is, as far as possible, helps assure well-being for all? Dauntingly, all the mounting evidence suggests it really is crunch time. So at this historic crossroads, do we choose the left-hand path, the cartoon on the left, which I rather like, and ensure our own demise, or do we determine to change course and nurture a safer future into being? Rather than experience breakdown, the signs of which are already with us, you only have to look at the news. How do we ensure breakthrough to the future we want through what's sometimes called the Great Transition? And this begs a social learning revolution on a grand scale and in a short space of time, relatively. So unlearning, relearning, new learning are all essential. And I'm talking about this big context first because it challenges formal education systems to become part of this broader movement. We need education systems to see themselves as part of the wholesale social learning movement that's now taking place. In this revolution, the dawning realization that we're the problem is a good start. So I love this cartoon. I use this quite a bit when I give talks. Our way of life is being threatened by a dark force. We must defend our way of life. What is this dark force which threatens our way of life? It's our way of life. Clever cartoon. So now there are increasing calls on people, governments, business, civil society to change course radically if we're to secure the future we want. So what is the role of education now? Well, surely it's to help to create that future, but within planetary boundaries. So there's a welcome rise of interest in academia about the role of higher education, given our unusual times, indicated by this event at Monash, learning to accept responsibility. What kinds of learning do we need to foster rather than undermine planetary health and community resilience? Another recent conference talked about the need to work together towards increasingly responsible education. Well, yes, great, but it kind of begs the question, well, what have we been doing all these years? Irresponsible education, or more mildly, non-responsible education? The subtitle of this conference session is, are universities ready to assume their full responsibility? I think the answer is not yet, but then this prior question must be asked, what is that hindering their ability to respond? And so I talk about this word which you won't find in the English dictionary, responsibility. The ability to respond in an appropriate and effective way, or even the ability to respond at all. So it begs the question, what stops universities and their members responding adequately to the challenges we face? This is a critical question for the whole sector. Clearly, some institutions are able to respond more fully than others, but urgent questions remain about the proportion of the institutions engaged worldwide, the extent of engagement across the spectrum of university functions, not just campus management, for example, and critically, the extent to which this response shifts the underlying assumptions, values driving institutions. My work for some years has focused on the paradigmatic and cultural factors that constrain the reimagination of HE, not least the reductionist and mechanistic worldview that has informed academic tradition for years. But we also have to recognize that universities are now shaped and limited by the marketized and competitive milieu that has been predominant for the last few decades. So I like this quote from Cristina Escrigas, which I think it rings, 2016, but I think it still rings true. Under pressure from neoliberal policies emphasizing marketization, competition, standardization, rankings, and a global testing culture, the traditional role of universities as sites of critical reflection and debate have been severely constrained, and similarly, their ability to respond to the sustainability challenges that have only grown in recent years. So this failure, I think, is recognized by UNESCO in its rhetoric and policy advice when it calls for transformation. So the Global Education Monitoring Report of 2016 noted that education itself needs to change, and that cartoon comes from that report on the left. And then in May 2021, as we know, UNESCO launched its ESG roadmap, which puts an even greater emphasis on transformation, which is very welcome, this call, I think. UNESCO also established the International Commission on the Futures of Education, which reported last year, independent commission. The final report came out in November, contains the lines, education is not fulfilling its promise to help us shape peaceful, just and sustainable futures. To do so, it says, education itself must be transformed. But I was digging around a little bit. You can see this quote comes from the interim progress report in March 2021. And as I noticed, there's a difference between the progress report in March and the final report which came out in November last year. So emphasis on rethinking education, as shown in this slide, is being changed in the final report to renewing education, which seems to me a weaker rendition. Also, the progress report's recognition of the importance of regenerative education, which is in a sense the new buzzword, is completely absent in the final report. That said, I find myself in agreement with the report's emphasis on education as a whole, not just ESD. Now, I'm delighted, as one of the people who, in a sense, came up with that idea of ESD many years ago, that it's had such an amazing take-up and impact globally. But we must be careful that that it does not blind us to the need to reimagine and revision education as a whole. And I think UNESCO has always been ambivalent about this. You know, are we talking about education as a whole needing to change, or are we just talking about promoting ESD? Question, you know, for debate, if you like. A second issue is that the UNESCO and the Commission both talk about the need to transform education, but they only weakly explore the values and assumptions that shape mainstream educational policy and sustainable development policy, for that matter, why things are as they are and why transformation is necessary. And this includes the WHEC documents, which are strong in vision, but a bit weak on the critique of the conventional neoliberal and economistic paradigm. My question for years, it's occupied me in my waking hours, is this: how should and how can education and learning be rethought and reconfigured to make a significant and central contribution of achieving a livable, more sustainable and just world? So now I think that kind of questioning is going on increasingly now by concerned students, particularly the student body. There's lots of evidence of that, but also by staff and some leaders about the role and purpose of education in conditions of threat and uncertainty. So let's look at that. The purpose of education as it was, the whole tradition of it over years, as it is now, and it changed in the last part of the last century. Ideally, what should it be, question mark, but also what could it be, given that education is slow to change? So practically speaking, what can it be? Maybe slightly short of the ideal, but what is the ideal? So let's look at that in a little bit more detail quickly. You might say that education has four functions or roles or purposes. The traditional socialization function, the vocational function to prepare people for employment, the liberal humanist function to develop the potential of individuals, which is an older tradition which has been neglected in recent years, really. All three of these are now under question in conditions of rapid social, technological, and environmental change. But I've argued for a long time, and so does UNESCO, that the transformative function now has to be prime, which doesn't mean we abandon the other three, but they all become together, if you like, in an integrated whole, which should be the way forward, I think. However, that said, I think we need to recognize that older progressive and liberal humanist conceptions of education have been marginalized in favor of the instrumental view supported by the neoliberal perspective on education. So I argue that that's had the effect of squeezing our conceptions of the purpose of education, the breadth of learning and depth of learning experience in service to the global testing culture and economic growth. See, I told you this is provocative. This is, in my view, this is a control model, and it limits necessary creativity, motivation, imagination, and collaboration. Rather, we need a model of education and learning which is necessarily experiential and innovative, explorative, and alive to the dynamics which are now happening in the world. They can be fully responsive to these shifting conditions. The International Commission detects early signs that we are moving towards a new ecologically oriented educational paradigm. That was in the previous slide. Well, I think that's great. I think it's correct, and I think it's extremely welcome, even such a movement is late in the day. However, to get towards the close of this talk, some evidence of this. So earlier in 2021, I was asked to write the lead paper for an international discussion hosted by the Great Transition Initiative on what they call the pedagogy of transition, educating for the future we want. So my lead essay stimulated a great response from thinkers and practitioners internationally. We had 56 contributions from all over the world, and that's now available and online. That's a screenshot of the homepage. And it boiled down to these two sections, frameworks and practices, with these four areas and these four questions being subject to discussion. And if you look at those, where are we now? In what ways is this satisfactory, unsatisfactory? Where do we need to be? How do we affect meaningful change? These are sort of fundamental four questions of any strategy, which can be applied at any level, from institutional to state, national, and international. And they are being increasingly asked. The conclusion of the discussion is presented on this slide. These are three summary points from the exercise, which are elaborated at length in my concluding essay. Interesting, I think this would chime, I think, with a lot that's been said at the conference this week. These ideas. Another little bit of evidence, if you like, of the lively discussion which is now taking place.
We're losing you. Stephen, can you speak up just a little bit?
Okay. So another little bit of evidence of the discussion which is now taking place. I was involved last year in a research topic exercise called Repurposing Universities for Sustainable Human Progress. We had 23 really excellent essays come in, and the editorial there is quoted, which I think that speaks for itself. 5 key points I don't have time to explain, but I would urge you to go and look at that link. Because I think it's pretty much where the debate is now, with this collection of essays. And interesting, we've had over 95,000 hits on the homepage, which is maybe indicative of the level of interest which is now taking place. So this shift, this transformation, I think we need to recognize it's a learning exercise for everybody. From the left-hand side here, which is the conventional and limited accommodative response towards an expanded ecological and holistic response. If I just click through those. So this is a shift from business as usual, if you like, to what you might term business as unusual, which needs to become the new norm. Last couple of slides. I put this one in because it's like a thought model, if you like, which might help some questions that might be asked of any educational policy or practice that is working towards sustainable or transformative education. Can be asked of any policy or curriculum statement. So clearly, positively, there's a strong movement now taking place, given the educational response to the SDGs, given UNESCO's roadmap, given the International Commission, given the Great Transition Initiative, given the EU's work on sustainability competencies, given this event itself. All this is really encouraging, but the critical response challenges remain. This is my last slide. terms of ethos, transformation, and learning. These are critical challenges. It has been said that the current education system is maladaptive to the conditions that now face us. There's now a shrinking window of opportunity to ensure that what is called the safe operating space for humanity, within planetary limits. So there are two realities at play here. The reality of university policies, structures and work, and all the things that occupy the waking moments of senior managers. And the other reality is the planetary imperative. Unless the former is sufficiently aligned to the latter, universities will find themselves increasingly irrelevant to the needs of our times. So this is what faces us in rethinking education for the future we want. The challenge is huge and unprecedented, but the opportunity is exciting and has extraordinarily positive potential, and that's critical to our shared future. A little bit of a rush, but a lot of material. I hope that's useful to stimulate discussion.
Thank you very much, Stephen. It will stimulate discussion, I'm sure. I also see that you've touched on so many different things that it will be a challenge to address many of those topics here on the panel. Without further ado, I will give the floor to those who have agreed to react to your presentation. And I will give the floor first to June Moashi, who's heading the section of Education for Sustainable Development at UNESCO. And she preferred to have a recorded video first, but she is with us and may intervene later in the conversation as well. So June, if we can play the video, that would be good.
Thank you, Hilech. Last year, UNESCO published a report from the International Commission on the Futures of Education, and it highlighted increasing socioeconomic inequalities, climate change, resource use that exceeds planetary boundaries, democratic backsliding, and disruptive technological automation as the hallmarks of our current historical juncture. Education is the most powerful element in preparing individuals and societies to address those common challenges. But so that education can fully deliver its purpose as suggested, we need to think differently about teaching and learning so they could engage head, hands, and heart of learners. Through developing critical competencies such as critical thinking, system thinking, and collaboration, learners are expected to understand the complexity of sustainable development, how the global challenges are interconnected, and also be equipped with action skills in order to contribute to problem solving in their daily context. To accelerate the achievement of the 2030 SDG agenda, UNESCO's Education for Sustainable Development for 2030 framework, we call it ESD for 2030, it was adopted in 2019 with underscoring the central role of education as a key enabler to achieve all SDGs. Last year, on the occasion of the World Conference on ESD, education stakeholders, including over 80 ministers, they adopted the Berlin Declaration and renewed their commitment to transforming education through implementing ESD. Ministries of Education and Environment, as well as education and development stakeholders in all countries, they are all invited to collaborate in fully integrating ESD into policies, learning environments, educators' development, youth empowerment, and community action. Let me try to summarize some of the key roles that higher education institutions are playing in sustainable development that UNESCO believes are critical. First, as many higher education institutions are already showcasing, they can be pioneers in adopting a whole institution approach, where sustainability is not just seen a guiding principle, but also a principle of action that is practiced in all areas of the university. For example, research, education and governance, social participation, and campus operations. Second, they are the key institutions that train future teachers as well as decision makers. higher education is expected to create and put into practice sustainability-ready pedagogy and training. Third, higher education institutions are where many youth leaders are engaging in action as students. For many, it is their first interaction with social action and will help shape the vision and inspiration of the world. Higher education institutions should facilitate youth engagement and creativity in all spheres of education, including, for example, the design of policies and programs on education and sustainable development. Finally, higher education institutions can become hubs for sustainable communities by providing expertise and support to local initiatives. It is a space where many different subsectors of society, including business, local communities, schools, and so on, they can all meet and collaborate. I am most interested in listening to other speakers today about their inspiring examples of action. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, June. And wonderful to have you with us on the screen. We would have loved to have all of you, of course, here in the room to have further conversations also beyond the limits of this room, but we will continue these conversations in the future. I will now turn to you, Professor Pornchai Mongkomvanit. You're the president of Siam University in Thailand, but also the IAU vice president and the chair of the IAU work on higher education and research for sustainable development, also leading the way for the global cluster on HESD. So how would you like to react to all these ideas shared?
Okay, thank you, Hillich. The first reaction is that I like to say yes, because as the administrator in higher education, we don't have any other choice because the situation is getting worse. So we should do it or having a lot of problems. So I think that higher education right now being the hope of the people to change and to transform our way of living and planet. I think that we just have a very bad situation about pandemic. And I think that this will not be the only crisis that we will be facing in our life. I can foresee the next crisis, probably the food crisis, and also economic crisis, regression. And if we still doing nothing, so the next one will be the climate crisis. So I think that we don't think that we have any choice. We have to talking about how can we do it effectively if we want our people and our planet still live a good life. And I also like to say that as an administrator for higher education, it is also our fault because the university has been in existence for about like 800 years. The people can live more than many thousand years or million years before without any problems. But our education that focus on growth rather than balance, we try to develop everything under the word efficiency to develop more things, more product in a very short time. And this in turn create and balance. So I think that where the people learn how to do this, I think that they have learned from the university. So it's a time that we should correct what we have done in the past. We should know how to teach about the parents rather than the growth. Teach how to change the way we live. As the speaker has mentioned, if we cannot change the way the people live, then there will be more and more problems. We cannot protect our way that we live with a lot of problems. The only way is to teach them to change the way we live. And when we look at our own institution, we also can see that our system is not aligned with what we should do. Because everybody talk about the holistic. But look at our university, we have very much compartmentalized system. And in each SDG, I think that it needs interdisciplinary, it needs transdisciplinary, and I think that the university needs to be reformed structurally. And I think that in order to do this, we should work together. Not only one university. I'm also very happy to be with our alliance because this is a crisis time. We cannot do anything alone. So I like to tell you about the example of our higher education for sustainable development cluster. Okay, we have altogether about 100 universities working together, and then we divided into 16 clusters. Each cluster also focus on one of the SDG, and then we also exchange the way that we live, exchange the way that we working within the university. So I think that this is one of the things that we have done. I still remember some good things from our cluster, like Tokai University. They cannot stop campus smoking until we work together, and then they can stop. And our university, during the pandemic, we also, Siam University, we also trying to learn from our colleagues in Bangladesh and the other way. And then we learn how to really work with the community. So I think that we have to work together, and then everything should be comprehensive and holistic. And what I like to say is that I like to see the university, the higher education in the future to have the empowerment system, participative, democratic, and trying to open our door in every direction. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ponchai. Also, as leader, it's very good that you commit to these transformations. Yes. Some will say, and why didn't we start much earlier? It's never too late to start, so it's very good that these ideas are coming through. I now give the floor to you, Sébastien Berger, in French it would be. You're the head of the Global Student Forum, and maybe you want to explain just quickly what that is so that people really understand also this global dimension of the student voice and the students from around the world to come together. Your intervention will be also topped up with a presentation online in a short video by Shireen Omondi, who is the elected member of the Global Student Forum Steering Committee, representing the voice of the Commonwealth Students Association from Kenya. So I give you the floor, and you have a great task to also voice what students are expecting and also doing.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. For those who don't know the Global Student Forum, we are quite a recently established organization that was created by the large regional and national student unions from all over the world to represent the interests of their voice towards the international community in the education sector. And we represent at this point 202 national unions of students from 122 countries and territories. To answer to the question, I think Professor Sterling and also President Hunchai framed the issue incredibly well when talking about market-oriented education that is primarily aimed at boosting growth and therefore intrinsically serving a broken system. And this broken system is fundamentally the reason why we are here, where we are today. We're talking about crisis throughout the relatively short duration of the lifetime of my generation. We have seen a multitude of severe economic and political crises, but it is truly nothing in comparison to what lies ahead of us if we don't find effective ways to change our way of living. Historically, a holistically reimagined approach to education must nurture the skills, the attitudes, the knowledge, but also the values for future generations to truly grasp the urgency to rethink the way that we are exploiting our planet and the most vulnerable groups among us, and that those who contributed the least to this crisis are paying and will continue to pay the heaviest price of us all. It's all out there at this point. We live in a knowledge society. We have knowledge available on demand on our hands, and we know about global warming. We know about breathtaking inequalities. We know about poverty, and that we are on track to fail on all commitments that we have set for ourselves through the 2030 agenda. And for education to fulfill its role we need this whole sector approach. We need unprecedented commitment and alignment among all parties involved in the process of education. Partnerships between students, between teachers, between the institutional leaderships, but also policymakers to succeed in transforming learning environments and building the capacity of educators and institutions to empower communities, to accelerate change on the local, on the national, on the international level. And for this new approach, I think it is key to instill hope in learners, while also not sparing the truth that if we don't act now with urgency and collectively, that the future looks really, really grim for our species if we don't radically change our ways. And ESD and active global citizenship education is, I think, one of the really good cards that we have left on our hands, but we need to make sure to play it timely and to play it well.
Yes, thank you very much. If we can play the video by Shireen, that would be much appreciated.
Students are very concerned about climate change and yet are often not taught how to engage in climate policy processes. Very few students know about the Paris Agreement or how to get involved in the climate process in their country. Therefore, higher education institutions need to identify strategic opportunities for partnership and collaboration and nurture alignment among various partners and networks. We also need to more capacity build for students, teachers, and policymakers, putting a specific focus on building climate action in academia. Delivering quality climate change education requires far-reaching changes in curricula and study programs. Redesigning learning and teaching strategies in our institution will be good for a start. Climate change needs to be embedded into school and university curricula as a cross-disciplinary and core subject. As the Global Students Forum, we recognize our convening power to build collaboration between regional, national, and local students' unions and organizations within our memberships to create a highly connected, mobilized, and effective political movement for climate action. In conclusion, higher education institutions have a specific responsibility to top up their efforts in combating climate change and use their role model function in society to lead by example. My name is Shireen Omondi from Kenya, representing the Commonwealth Students Association in the Global Students Forum.
Thank you very much, Shireen. Similarly, we would have loved to welcome you here and have further conversations, but we will do that in the future. So I would like to give the floor now to Chuck, to Charles Hopkins, known as Chuck, leading the UNESCO chair in reorienting education towards sustainability. We've been working together for more than 30 years, Chuck, in different fora. We've been very active. We've been advocating for sustainable development for so many years. So what do you see? What are the structural changes that happen, those that are called for by Stephen and highlighted by Paul, by the students, by June, by Pam in the opening, or Pornchai, and what we've heard throughout the conference? So what is it that you would like to say to all this?
Well, yes, you're absolutely right. Some universities have really been taking up their responsibility. In fact, leading up to the Earth Summit in Rio in 1992, first of all, there was a meeting in Tauwa where about 60 university leaders got together to discuss what is the responsibility of higher education in this whole move towards sustainable development. And then again in Halifax, we were working just before the Earth Summit in '92 to try and with UNESCO to try and get a voice there at the Earth Summit because we did feel a responsibility, and how are we going to do it? Regarding Stephen's excellent presentation and sort of setting things to consider that we need to talk about, I would say that by beginning with Stockholm and not mentioning Rio, we leave it in that context that while some of the beginnings was in environmental concern, The problem was that the environmental concern, which was largely voiced by about 20% of the population, was against Pareto's law of 80-20. 80% of the world's population were in abject poverty. They wanted development through communication. They could see the way the other 20% lived. And so there was this conundrum. What we call developing countries, largely abandoned colonies, were struggling on their own. And so what we had to come up with was a how are we going to work this together? And of course, Madam Brundtland, with her commission, I presented to the commission. That gives you some idea how long I've been involved in it. But she didn't take my advice, unfortunately. But at any rate, the idea, the best we could come up with that we could sell to world leaders was a mesh of the two. Development, what 80% want, but sustainable development, a nice loose term so that it could be adapted by business and industry, who largely were sold that it was really eco-efficiency. You're going to save money as if you cut back on energy, water, and waste. So there was that component. I think it's important to realize that if we simply go into it with an environmental approach, which is the big issue, but not recognizing social and what has been added, peace and so on. And let me just, if you mind, one other component. I was also part of the writing team for the first, now we have the 2030 agenda. Well, the first implementation plan was called Agenda 21, and we fought very hard to get one of the 40 chapters. Today there are 17, but originally there were 40 chapters, and one was addressing education and its role. And when we were trying to come up with how we would poise this, we recognized that the world was flooded with what we termed adjectival educations. That is, peace education, environmental education, development education, all these others. The Minister of Education, I think it was yesterday morning, said when the society has a crisis, universities have a department. and what we wanted to avoid was adding sustainability education, which would be another department. We realized that to transform society, we had to engage everyone. So that's why we chose the term education for sustainable development. And because sometimes we're criticized for the word for. How can it be education? All education is for something.
Yeah.
There is purpose in the whole thing. So I'd like to talk about transformation. I'll do that later. That was the other big part that Stephen and people put in, but thanks.
Yeah, very good. Thank you. Last but not least, for this first round, I would like to give the floor to you, Joanna Newman. You're the Secretary General of a very dear partner organization. We have this three big associations partnership also on trying to move higher education for sustainable development into the future. So you had the Association of Commonwealth Universities, the ACU, and we also work with AUF, the Association des Universités Francophones. But I would like to give you the floor also to say something about the work that you do as an ACU, obviously, how you react to the presentations that have been made, but maybe also say how we see that it is still very often very difficult to get higher education to the discussion tables, which is also amazing. And that's where we come together very often at the UN High-Level Political Forum, where we bring many of the university leaders into the rooms to hopefully make the difference as well, so that we're heard. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Hillage. Thank you very much. And thank you to all the speakers so far, and also to Professor Sterling. And your question, what is education for? And then your four definitions. And the one that I was looking at, and then you sort of highlighted it, of course, is transformative education. Because I think we all agree, certainly in this room, that education is transformative. And we also agree in this room that higher education is transformative and transforms not just lives but societies. But we are at the third UNESCO World Conference on Higher Education, and we, as three networks representing over 2,000 institutions, are making the case that the High-Level Political Forum and other places, that if you are talking about development and prosperous, peaceful societies, then you have to have higher education in the room, because you cannot achieve one of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals without the contribution of higher education, whether that's in pedagogy, whether that's in teacher training, whether that's in applied or blue sky research. Universities have a role to play. So if we agree that they are key to transforming society, including sustainable development and all the other global challenges, then the thing that we haven't actually mentioned either in this room is something that President Kenyatta from Kenya opened the Conference for Commonwealth Education Ministers a few weeks ago in Nairobi. And he pointed out that by 2030, the gross tertiary enrollment in Korea and Japan would be something like 90%, but in parts of sub-Saharan Africa, it's still reaching 5 to 8%. So if we've agreed that universities are key to sustainable development, then we must also agree that it's totally unfair that there is no access. So if you don't want to call it a growth model, let's call it an access model. Now, we have the privilege of working in a network with over 500 universities, and through our wonderful cooperation with IAU and AUF, there are heaps of good practice to call on, of universities that have addressed their campuses, that have divested from fossil fuel, that want to be carbon neutral, that educate their students, that embed the SDGs. So there's masses of good practice that we can promote and share. And of course, the SDSN network does a huge amount of work in this and harvests data to provide UN governments with. So that's all really important. And it's providing evidence, because basically we want the final result to be that countries understand and demand that the percentage of their national budgets is spent on the tertiary sector, including TVET, as well as on primary and secondary. And that's a goal that the ACU has with IAU and AUF. So what actually needs to happen? Well, so we have to act on those examples of good practice. You know, there was a colonial model as well of MOOCs and massification that sort of assumed that big brands of education would somehow be able to swoop down and provide electronic access and suddenly everyone would have an education. Well, that clearly doesn't work. But there are lots of models that the ACU is involved in. For example, co-creating content in East Africa to provide really fantastic quality modules that can be shared. We teach the teachers who then teach the students. So we're addressing the demand and supply issue, which is massive in higher education. And there are lots of other organisations doing fantastic work in that. I have heard university leaders throughout the last few days talk about the systemic changes that need to happen. So opening your doors, listening to partners, divesting yourself of colonial. When you talk about decolonisation, don't just stick to the curriculum, look at the practices around the whole of the campus. And the corollary to that, or the other side, is perhaps also that higher education is a fantastic and wonderful thing. Universities are struggling in some ways to understand how they can change and open their doors, and there are also good practice there. But they are also educating fundamentally. The education that they are providing is one which means that the students who leave that university will be able to be equipped to challenge, to be curious, to be flexible, to be adaptable, and to ask questions. And that's really important, and I think sometimes that's lost in the debate about universities. They have an essential function. So how do we create different systems, equitable partnerships that actually help? One thing that happened in this, I'll just close with this, evidence. So UNESCO have an initial report which was launched the other day, exploring international aid for tertiary education. It's not perfect, it's very early beginnings, but if we can pool our resources to show what works, how it works, and how we can actually create change over the next few years so that you do have a situation in countries like across sub-Saharan Africa where you have a fantastic youth population who need access to higher education. And at the moment, the modalities for them to achieve it are highly imperfect, including all the scholarships that we run, because it only addresses a small percentage of the population. So I'll end there.
Thank you so much. And so what actually all we're saying is that a lot is happening. And we heard that in other sessions as well. And many examples are even here in the room. I look around and I see many who have bubbles around where I see we have these initiatives. There's a lot happening and we're getting together. So I will jump to the question, what are the challenges and barriers to ESD that need to be addressed in order for us to move forward? All those great ideas that we heard on the screen and in the room, what then is failing? What is not working and what can we do? If I give you each 1 minute, then we have a chance to also ask for some input from the room. So I will start with you, Sebastian.
Well, I said that in the session 2 days ago. I do think that we need to start with preparing young people from the very, very early childhood onwards. So we need to start with implementing quality climate change education for sustainable development at the primary age and go all the way through to higher education. And I do think that student unions have been very, very loud and at the forefront of calling for action in this regard towards governments. And I hope that we will continue to be loud to call for action towards institutions through this whole sector approach that you were touching upon, by not only mainstreaming education for sustainable development, but also creating institutions that are being a hub for students to develop their own initiatives and to implement green practices in the future through green office models, where we really have students, faculty, staff, leadership working together and implement concrete action plans for the sustainability of operations, but also how to transform the learning experience for their students. I think this is key.
Okay. Chuck?
I think the engagement of all the different sectors, what we struggled with was how do we make sure that it reaches everyone, all of the students who go through, and reaches all the different departments. Within higher education in particular, it's so hard to bring staff together, to have this kind of a discussion. Sustainability lacks a vision. We're still driving the sustainability bus by looking in the rear view mirror. We're looking at what we're trying to get away from, and change. But for that inspirational vision of, the city on the hill kind of thing, we're lacking that. And trying to engage with professors who really don't feel it's their strength and not their responsibility. How do we begin that kind of a dialogue to show the relevance of philosophy, the need to address worldview? How do we engage the social sciences to try and even to bring about change within our own university? We usually start with the natural and physical sciences. How can we better understand climate change? But we know the what. It's the how. How do we engage and come up with some kind of systemic approaches? You're saying we need not only the whole institution approach, we need the whole system, higher education approach, and beyond that, moving into engaging the whole UN system and national governments.
Very good. So now I will give the floor 1 minute, Joanna, 1 minute, June, 1 minute, Paul. Then I come to you, Pornchai. Pam, you want to say something? And we turn to the room. So Joanna.
Supply and demand, change the system. Create systemic change within institutions, but challenge all institutions to change their model. Get rid of 3-year undergraduate degrees. Get rid of summer and autumn terms. Find out how you can reach out to other students. If you want sustainable development, then institutions have to change from a 19th century Humboldtian model of what a university is for. And don't lose the mission and what it does, but change the modalities and how it does it.
I think you liked the little logo that Stephen had on the screen. If you don't change, change will not happen.
That's right. I would like Stephen to come back in. We can't see his face.
We can't see Stephen. He disappeared, but he's with us, I'm sure. So, June, would you like to react to this? 1 minute.
No, I can only echo because, I mean, UNESCO is more convening this kind of dialogue, but I completely agree with all what we have, you already expressed, and especially Joanna, when you said that we really have to really change, and no option, it's not an option, and if higher education is not included in this big business of sustainable development, we will be failing, because university is really assuring the quality of a lot of things happening in the society through research, producing good thinking, pedagogy, also to inform teachers even beyond universities, working with other levels of societies and so on. So we really have to find concrete ways maybe to work it on together, to create some concrete examples of collaboration to place higher education institutions in this big business of sustainability. Sorry, yeah. I'm a bit vague because I'm not coming from the higher education institution, but we are very looking forward to continue our collaboration. Thank you.
No, but it's very good because you've also convened higher education. You've brought us to the table, which is essential, and not all organizations do. So the Berlin conference was a very important one, where we also got the voice out. It's good that the Berlin Declaration is adopted. We now need to see if it's implemented, which is the next step. I would like to give you the floor, Paul.
Yeah, thank you. So this session, what's bringing to my mind is I sat through the intergovernment negotiations on the SDGs themselves for 9 months, and as David Donoghue and Ambassador Kamau were the co-facilitators. But just to tell this audience and to make it very clear, the word to get into paragraph 52, partnership for the goals, I think the Academy was mentioned at one stage 17 times in the document, and it actually nearly was reduced to 0. In fact, it's only mentioned 3 times now, right? Because a lot of the so-called stakeholders, including corporate civil society and particularly the governments, are not clear what role academia can play, or that they would be a key game changer. Now, that to us is outrageous, but that was the reality, right? Now, when you saw the COVID crisis, though, what happened, right? You could actually see the 2 critical actors in Ireland, I would say, was the army and the universities, right? Because we did all the contact tracing, the vaccination programs, we turned the campuses, to provide for nurses and doctors and others, etc., who were, and so on. And also, so the point is that we showed that we could, science became central, we could actually drive transformation. So the key lesson for that, and to come to the point, is that we have to be much more politically active. We have to engage in the science policy interface, and we have to show governments that they have to force this change for corporates and society to take care of the planet and take care of other people, not just at home, but all over the world. So we have a responsibility to change our governance, but also to change the governance of governments at both regional and global level, so that they do incorporate our science and our teachings, but we do actually have to take a role in this science policy interface. And I know that's why we're here today, and that's why it's so important that we have AIA and SDSN and UNESCO, etc. But to realize that academics have to actually show people why they are so important, or why universities are so important, and they actually have to get political.
So we have a few appointments ahead: Stockholm plus 50, the United Nations High-Level Political Forum, the TESS as well, the Education Summit, and then many of our conferences where we put this heart and center at the heart of the discussions. So Joanna, you just came in, point shot. 1 minute.
No, she was...
Okay, so I'm first. Okay, I think that the question is that what is the barrier towards what we are talking? I think that the main barrier, in one word, is the ability to unlearn. Because, we always stick to the old paradigm. And then, but things have changed quite a lot with the pandemic, with the technology disruption. So I think that we need to be unlearned. in higher education need to be unlearned. And then the next thing is that we have to think in the holistic way. And what I think that we need to be success is the participative activities. I think that we like to see the university with the structure that allow interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary. At the same time, we should have the program learning outcome, and what is above the program learning outcome should be our sustainability goals. And then what we like to see is that within that outcome, we like to have the course that is jointly developed by the professor and the student. You can have your own pathway as long as you can arrive at the learning outcome. And the learning outcome should be under the goals of sustainability. So I think that that should be my answer. What is the barrier and how to make it happen? Thank you.
Thank you. Pam, you also noted quite a few things you would like to react, I think.
Just one thing. I think very much has come up, but I would like to make a little one political comment about this. And that is, we have a crisis with the Ukraine situation and so on, and there is a need of support and help. But I am worried about that much of this money needed is taken from aid money. And are we going to have the global perspective of the Sustainable Development Goals and cutting down the programs, many very good programs going on in cooperation between the North and South and in the developing countries. So I just want to make that message. I'm very disappointed that we take those money which will have an implication and consequences quite for a long time.
So looking at those reorienting the financial support, and we've advocated for that all through the conference as well. If universities want to be future fit, they need more support also financially. We have time for 2 comments in the room, so if you have the microphone over there, I think. Where do I see questions maybe? I will start with Carrie, and then Brendan. And here you have one, and there. So we will have 4. If we can stick to 1 minute.
Yeah, one question. Kerry Facer, University of Bristol. Thank you for that. I want to foreground the fact that the climate issue is a time-limited problem. It is not something that actually is the main concern. If we want to make the changes, we have to make them now. Which means that actually adult education and public and social learning is the priority. So this isn't about educating future students for in 10 years' time making change. This is about a radical, disruptive adult education initiative that we need to develop to create social transformation. So how can our universities rapidly pivot away from the idea that their sole focus is 18 to 21-year-olds to create a major program of adult education that is oriented to effecting social transformation now? Thank you.
Thank you. Then Brendan.
Thank you. I just wanted to pick up on one of the key words.
Maybe say also who you are.
Sorry, I'm Brendan O'Malley, Editor-in-Chief of University World News. I just wanted to pick up on one of the questions that hasn't been spoken about, words that hasn't been spoken about much, which is peace, which is in the conference description. And we haven't heard much at all in this conference about the role that universities can play in establishing and maintaining peace. And I was wondering if you could address that. What concrete steps can they take?
Okay. I would like to give you the floor. Maybe introduce yourselves as well, very quickly. And 1 minute.
Bonjour, I'm Anoush Terjanian. I sit on the Governing Council of the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. And I wanted to pick up on this point about peace and the point that Monsieur Pongchai, you made, which is that, of course, we have a time issue, worry, a concern, time presses. And the reflex usually in those moments is to reinforce the very vertical and authoritarian structures, medieval structures of universities as they have existed for a long time. And yet, as Joanna Newman points out, we have a decolonial imperative, and we also have a democratic imperative to open up the space and to understand that democratic governance of universities is not bad management. On the contrary, transparency, accountability, and openness actually gives us inputs for better decision making. So I'd like to talk about the potentials for democratic governance. Thank you.
Thank you. These are all the questions for future debate, unfortunately, because we're also time limited. But I would like to give the floor for 1 minute to Roberto, and I would like to revert to you, Stephen, to give us some final comments.
Thank you. I just want to say that we all recognize all the efforts that universities and organizations like UNESCO and others are doing in relation to sustainable development. And some governments, the efforts that some governments are doing. But the bad news is that business remains as usual, or even worse. So something is lacking, or something is not there. And I would like to take, I think Paul's view, that I think we need to be politically involved, not only with governments, but even, I would say, more with communities. At the end of the day, those are the ones who could make the difference. I am an environmental economist, and I've been working with communities that really make the difference. So if we don't do that, I agree. Universities have to continue doing research and so on and so forth, but that will not be enough.
Well, thank you, Roberto from Udual, Latin America. Very good for these very important points that call for profound transformation. You talk actually to the point that Kerry was making, also bringing in all these other groups into the university and offer these opportunities. Peace building, no peace building if we don't address these issues and the university is not engaging, and then the governance part. But I'm sure there are many other discussions that will emanate from this, but I will give the floor back to you, Stephen, in the last 2 minutes for this session.
Thank you, Hilish. Well, what an interesting debate. We probably need another 3 hours to get through some of the issues that have been raised.
Can do it again.
Quickly, we are in extraordinary times globally, but socially, economically, environmentally, and so on. They are scary times. We're in a state of transition. It's scary, but it's also exciting. And I think the concern that's being raised here and across the board is also giving rise to an awful lot of innovation and creativity, and in that I find a lot of hope. There's certainly a lot of rising interest, the kind of things that myself and many other people have been doing for years. There's suddenly a new interest in all this. Now, what is this? What should we be doing? How do we do it? And these questions are coming out all the time. The fact this debate is taking place now, the fact this conference is taking place with such the title, Housing and Sustainable Development, really good. And I think we need to be encouraged by the shifts which are taking place, even though the academic tradition and structures are not really, over the last 200 years, are not really fit for where we should be now. There are shifts taking place. Civic engagement is really important. Universities recognizing they need to be learning organizations is really important. Exercising critical reflexivity, exercising interdisciplinarity, listening to young people, engaging with the ethical dimension of these issues, developing a kind of what I would call a collective intelligence within the university around these issues and their implications for policy and practice. All of this is important. Also, changing the reward structures would help in many universities to allow collaboration and interdisciplinarity. So, what can I say in a couple of seconds? But you get the drift. I think the term is we need transformation in order that universities can be transformative.
Oh,
I think
a lot we have to do.
I'm reasonably hopeful on all of this.
So I see the conversation starts here already, but one of the questions you asked was, are we educating people for a future nobody wants? Well, you see that we're all mobilized against that. No, that's not what we want. And yet, too often, maybe that's what is still happening. So I would like to thank everyone for having come to this important session. Hopefully this will trigger much more debate in the many different fora that we will facilitate in the days, weeks, months to come. Also, thank you, Brendan, for bringing up that point on peace and democracy. And also, I would like to highlight something that you haven't said, but UWN is developing a hub for SDGs where universities will have a space to also explain and advocate for the role of higher education for the future. And so that's also very much welcome because you give a wonderful space out in the world on everything that is happening. So we will be working with you very strongly. I would like to thank the technicians for their great support for this session.
Thank you very much.
Everybody who has been involved, and also for the translators, for those who used it. And thank you for your attention.